I want to welcome everyone to the Senate Budget Committee. I want to start with a bit of the business of the committee because I know people are asking what is our intention with respect to going to a markup. And I want to make clear to everyone that I intend to go to a markup in the committee, and I want to do it sooner rather than later. The unknown for us is when we will get CBO's reestimate. And we don't have an answer on that. They some time ago talked to us about March 9th as a time they might have a reestimate. Since that time, they have indicated that might slip. So we just have to wait and see. But I will be talking to all the members of the committee, and I'm going to start that consultation immediately. We'll start consultations next week with respect to members of the committee, and we'll certainly be talking to Senator Sessions about timing, and hopefully we'll know in the near term what CBO's schedule is with respect to reestimate. I wanted to start with that. I also wanted to
Thank you. That's, I appreciate that. I know that the chairman deeply cares about these issues, and I think that process will be good for America. Thank you.
Yeah, I do too. Look, you know, we may have some disagreements on some part of what's happened heretofore, and I'll talk a little about some of that as well. We also have places where we agree, and I think it is good for us as a body. I think it's good for the country to have the fullest possible debate. I think it's, you know, last year in some ways we got overtaken by a separate process because very early on a negotiation began at a higher level than ours. And that had an effect on what we did. I do want to say that when I hear discussions that we don't have a budget, that I don't agree with that. I just think that's wrong because when we did the Budget Control Act in August, that provided a budget for this year and next. And the Budget Control Act was not the normal way of doing a budget. I'd be the first one to say that. But in many ways, it's a stronger document than a typical budget resolution. Because a typical budget resolution never goes to the President for signature. It's purely a congressional document. The Budget Control Act is actually a law passed overwhelmingly in the Senate, 74-26. And not only does it have the force of law, it also set discretionary spending caps for 10 years instead of the 1 year that you normally have in a budget resolution. And it provided enforcement mechanisms, including a 2-year deeming resolution, which improves the enforcement of budget points of order, something that I insisted on in the Budget Control Act. And finally, it created a reconciliation-like super committee to address entitlement and tax reforms. And it backed that process up with a $1.2 trillion sequester. So it is certainly different than a typical budget resolution. But we do have the critical elements of a budget in place. Now, I'd be the first to say I'd like to see it different than what was adopted in the Budget Control Act. I'm sure each of us would have done it differently if we had the power to do. Today's hearing, I want to focus on now, focuses on the outlook for the U.S. and global economy. We have three excellent witnesses. Dr. Alan Blinder, former Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, now Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Dr. Joel Prakken, the Chairman of Macroeconomic Advisors, one of the most respected macroeconomic firms in the country, and Dr. Ike Brannon, the Director of Economic Policy at the American Action Forum. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. We appreciate very much you're spending time with us. I'd like to briefly review the economic situation confronting the country. It's important to remember the economic crisis that we have come through. In 2008 and 2009, we experienced the worst recession since the Great Depression. The economy contracted almost 9% in the fourth quarter of 2008. That is really stunning. 9% contraction in the fourth quarter of 2008. We lost 800,000 private sector jobs in January of 2009 alone. Housing market crisis was rippling through the economy, with home building and home sales plummeting and record foreclosures. And we faced a financial market crisis that threatened to set off a global economic collapse. Credit markets were largely frozen. We've come a long way since then. The federal response to the crisis, including actions taken by the Federal Reserve, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and Congress, successfully pulled us back from the brink. It's clear that our economic situation would be much worse now if we had not had that federal response. In fact, one of our witnesses today, Dr. Blinder, along with economist Mark Zandi, who was former advisor to the McCain presidential campaign, completed a study in 2010 that measured the impact of federal actions on shoring up the economy. Their conclusion was as follows: we find that its effect on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge and probably averted what could have been called Depression 2.0. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, but not nearly as much as most had feared, and not nearly as much as if policy makers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy responses saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost. This chart shows Dr. Blinder and Dr. Zandi's estimate of the number of jobs we would have had without the federal response. It shows we would have had 8 million fewer jobs in the second quarter of 2010 if we had not had the federal response. Now, I understand Dr. Blinder will present estimates for the number of jobs saved in 2011 as well, which I look forward to hearing. Although the recovery has recently shown signs of strengthening, it has been a long and difficult road back. Now, that's not unexpected. Economists have found that following recessions caused by or accompanied by a severe financial crisis, the recoveries tend to be shallower and take much longer. Here's what two leading economists, Dr. Carmen Reinhart and Dr. Vincent Reinhart, found in their research, and I quote: real per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lower during the decade following a severe financial crisis. In the 10-year window following severe financial crises, unemployment rates are significantly higher than in the decade that preceded the crisis. The decade of relative prosperity prior to the fall was importantly fueled by an expansion in credit and rising leverage that spans about 10 years. It is followed by a lengthy period of retrenchment that most often only begins after the crisis and lasts almost as long as the credit surge. In other words, we should expect to see a period of lower than normal growth and relatively higher unemployment right now because we are recovering from a severe financial crisis. If we look at private sector job growth, we see it has improved dramatically from when we were in recession. As I noted, in January of 2009, the economy lost more than 800,000 private sector jobs. Private sector job growth returned in March of 2010, and we've now had 22 consecutive months of growth. There's some additional positive signs that we see in the economy. As I mentioned before, we've had 22 consecutive months of private sector job growth. Last week, unemployment claims fell to their lowest level since April of 2008. We've seen 9 consecutive quarters of real GDP growth, and GDP growth is now expected to have risen to 3.1% in the fourth quarter of 2011. Housing starts are up 25% since December of 2010. Consumer confidence was up sharply in the last 2 months of 2011. U.S. auto manufacturers are returning to profitability, and state revenues are showing signs of improvement. But those good news elements are no reason for complacency. There are serious risks that remain to economic recovery. For example, unemployment and underemployment remain far too high. Housing continues to pose a threat, with too many homes still in foreclosure or underwater. Political deadlock in Washington could block key measures. Federal, state, and local budget cuts could add too much near-term fiscal drag. And the European debt and fiscal crisis is creating uncertainty and threatening U.S. exports, as we saw reported on the front page of the Washington Post yesterday. I hope all of our colleagues read the story about what's happening with the slowdown in Europe and how that is affecting U.S. companies as well. Beyond that, we have what I have termed our own debt threat. We have a debt that is too high, growing too fast, and it is imperative that we present a plan to deal with it. I was part of the Fiscal Commission, part of the Group of Six. In both of those efforts, we came up with plans to reduce debt by some $4 trillion over what would otherwise occur. Let me just say, I personally favor an even more ambitious effort than that. My fondest wish would be that we could come together around a plan that would reduce the debt from what otherwise will occur by about $5.5 to $5.6 trillion. Why do I pick that number? Because we could balance the budget in 10 years if we put in place a plan of that magnitude. The timing of when it begins is critical because the economy is still weak, so I would not personally start tough medicine until we see the economy doing better. But I would put in place the plan right now to achieve the kind of debt reductions that I've described. I believe that would be a tonic for confidence in the economy. I believe it would help assure markets that we're serious about the fiscal affairs of our country.